Don't let them in. Hillary Clinton's a little more liberal. Well, the policies at that time is we had legislation in the United States that did not allow us to bring in immigrants. Okay? Immigrants. But what was the real reason why? What was there a worldwide attitude toward going on? What's that? It might be. That's a good guess, but what were we discriminating against at the time? Well, and what else? Jewish people. It wasn't positive to be a Jewish person in the United States. You were discriminated against as if you were African American or whatever. What's that called? Anti-Semitism. There was a huge worldwide anti-Semitism attitude in this entire world, where Jews were looked at as lower life people, and they didn't want to get involved in bringing those people in. It would be like in the height of the 60s, which is kind of a poor example, but not bad, if the president would have said, we're going to bring every single black person we can in from Africa because they're being persecuted. You think that had gone over real well in the 1960s? We didn't even want the black people that were living there to have equal rights. So it was the same type of reason. So the United States did not act on these war crimes because of worldwide anti-Semitism, prior immigration legislation in the United States, and isolationist attitudes of the 1930s, which politicians were discouraged from assuming the responsibility for the fate of any refugees. Okay? Well, finally, late in the war, the State Department, because of pressure, did allow 21,000 Jewish refugees to enter the United States. Finally, late in the war, the State Department did allow 21,000 Jewish refugees to enter the United States during the war. And also, late in the war, President Roosevelt established what was called the War Refugee Board. The War Refugee Board. And although we did not allow those Jewish refugees to come into the United States, what did the War Refugee Board do? Made arrangements for about 2,000 European Jews to move where? In safe havens in other countries, not ours. So what did we do concerning the Holocaust situation in Europe during World War II? We finally allowed 21,000 Jewish refugees to enter the United States. That was done by the State Department. And then Roosevelt established what was known as the War Refugee Board, which helped move about 200,000 European Jews to safe havens in other countries. Okay? Now, there is a little handout I gave you that I'll let you read on your own. We won't hold you accountable for it, but it's good information, and I think you should probably read that. War against the Jews, etc. Okay, so make sure you read that, and you will have an opportunity to see the Holocaust Museum in its entirety when we're in D.C. Okay, that'll move us to our next and last subtopic, which is the Big Three. The Big Three. And this is kind of an interesting subtopic because we're going to go back in history a little bit here. When did Germany surrender? Anna, now that I asked you that, when did they surrender in Europe? May 8th of 1945. Well, this news of this final surrender of Germany was obviously joyfully splashed across the front pages of all American newspapers in May of 1945. But what wasn't told to the American people so much was what happened in February of 1945, several months before the surrender of Germany to the Allies. Happened in February of 1945. And what happened in February of 1945 is there was a meeting in Yalta, which was a resort city in the Soviet Union. In February of 1945, there was a meeting in Yalta, which was a resort city in the Soviet Union. Who do you think was at the meeting, Mackenzie? The Big Three, which were who? Who are those people?
Oh wait, yeah, Roosevelt.
President Roosevelt was there.
Stalin.
Premier Stalin of the Soviet Union, and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. All met, you got that one, that's a good one. Yalta, a resort city in the Soviet Union. The big three were President Roosevelt, Prime Minister Churchill, and Premier Stalin. Now, the purpose of this meeting, which is important you understand, is they were going to try to decide the fate of Europe after World War II ended. They were meeting in February of 1945 to try to decide what are we going to do with Europe after World War II. And what they agreed upon in this meeting in February of 1945, deciding the fate of Europe, was to be kept secret until the Germans surrendered, which occurred in May of 1945. So these guys actually met several months before that, anticipating what in Germany? A victory and surrender. Now, this final agreement between Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt concentrated on these four main issues. These four main issues. Number one, after the war, German territory would be divided into 4 occupation zones. After the war, German territory would be divided into 4 occupation zones. And who is going to be responsible for governing these different zones, do you think? U.S., Russia, Great Britain, and France. Very good, Courtney. France. So each of these 4 occupying powers, Great Britain, France, Russia, and the United States, is going to be responsible for governing the different zones. Now, I don't have all the zones put together. And this is quite a map. We'll work with it. Another topic of discussion was the capital city of Berlin. And they were trying to figure out who was going to be governing the city of Berlin, and they decided that all 4 countries would have a say. They would govern it jointly. Now, I'm going to give you a little preview first. This is not going to be exactly right. We'll just go from there. Okay? Later on, they're going to split Germany into 2 parts, aren't they? They're going to split into what? East Germany and West. And East Germany is going to be what type of government? Communist. And West Germany is going to be non-communist. Okay, that's how it's going to come out later, which we'll talk about. The thing that was kind of weird is Berlin was also going to be split right down the middle. The trouble is, it's right in the middle of what? East Germany. So you're trying to keep the western part of a city non-communist when it is sitting in the middle of a communist country. And we'll talk more about that later, so just keep that in mind. And what happens is, yeah, the Berlin Wall comes up, which we'll talk about. Okay, the second main issue of this final agreement between the big three said that the Soviet Union would annex eastern Poland. Do you think Europe looks the same today as it did prior to World War II? No, that's what we're talking about here. So the Soviet Union would annex eastern Poland, which means they're going to annex it as part of what? Russia, okay? Now, Premier Stalin, however, had to assure to the other the other two, that Poland would have a government of their own choosing by virtue of a free election. Okay? They had to have a government of their own choosing by a virtue of a free election. That's what Roosevelt and Churchill needed to hear, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin assured them that Poland would have a government of their own choosing, although it would be annexed into Russia.
Did you say all of Poland? Or
no, eastern, just the eastern part. And what would the third part be? Russia would agree to launch an attack against Japan, where? In the Pacific Theater. Because although Germany surrendered, we still have a heck of a battle ahead of us, which is going to be part 4 of our lecture, of what's going on in the Pacific. So the third part of this agreement between the big three is Stalin stated that Russia would launch an attack and assist the Allies against Japan in the Pacific theater of the war. Now, Russia going to do that for free? Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, so Russia was, they had nothing, no part in the Soviet Union, like whatsoever, they weren't even like affected really.
Not a ton, but they helped. I mean, they helped. But they didn't do it for free. They wanted control of a set of islands that Japan owned called the Kuril Islands. The Kuril Islands. And Russia said, we will support the Allies and provide things for the Allies in the Pacific theater, and in exchange for our support, we want to take control of the Kuril Islands that were owned by Japan. I think for bases, military bases. Now this is interesting, President Woodrow Wilson, because the fourth part of the agreement between the big three was they were going to establish a new international organization called what? President Wilson? Not a League of Nations, but it'll turn out to be called what? The United Nations, which is really what Wilson was looking for way back. So, number one, after the war, German territory would be divided into 4 occupation zones. Number 2, the Soviet Union would annex eastern Poland. Number 3, Russia would launch an attack against Japan in the Pacific theater of the war. And 4, they would establish a new international organization after the war called the United Nations. Okay? All right, we're going to have a little quiz tomorrow, so I'll just kind of throw you some things I think you should know. I would study up the little bit of lecture I gave you on D-Day in Europe. I wouldn't get overly concerned about all those numbers on 3 million soldiers and that type of thing. Don't get hung up on those, but certainly know about D-Day, who organized it, what its goal was, where they landed, what beach they landed on, Omaha Beach, and what happened as an end result of the invasion on D-Day. I'd know that. I would know who Thomas Dewey was. I'd know a little bit about the Battle of the Bulge. I would know a little bit about what 2 significant things I mentioned after Hitler's suicide, that his 1,000-year Reich that lasted 12 years, that we surrendered on May 8th, Germany surrendered on May 8th, 1945, and that day became known as VE Day. I know a little bit about the Holocaust I told you about, and the main thing I'd concentrate on is why the United States did not really get in there and involved and help that situation, why they were inhibited. I'd know who the big three were, and I would know where they met, and I would know what their final agreement stated. It's going to be a 45-point quiz tomorrow, short answer, and we'll be out in the Commons. I made arrangements, so we will be out in the Commons tomorrow. When we get done with that, then we are going to move into part 4 of the Pacific Theater, and we're going to concentrate on that, especially Iwo Jima, and we'll spend some extra time on that, show you some video, and talk about the misidentification of one of the soldiers who lifted the flag at Mount Suribachi. Okay, all right, good job. Yes? Well, we felt like we didn't we gave them, we like we gave them jobs, no leadership, their jobs.
Part 4. That's part of the time that we saw what they wanted to copy and not saying it. Again, during the agreement, we said we had to make sure that Poland was did we not know that?
We didn't know the extent of where it was going, and it got worse. And you know, these agreements after World War II are going to lead us to what we know as the Cold War. Right?
Yeah.
It'll be